Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Schrag, and I direct the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to another year of talks in our Future of Energy series. This is really one of the speaker series that I most enjoy, where we bring people from government, from academia, from industry, from all over the world to share their views and perspectives on the future of energy. And it's a great privilege that they're willing to join us here. I should also note that the series is sponsored by Bank of America, and we greatly appreciate their support, which makes all of this possible. Before I introduce Steve Koonin, let me just tell you a little bit about the fall lineup, which is continuing to evolve, but we have a slight change. On October 12th, we have Sunil Sinha, who's the CEO of Tata Quality Management Services in the Tata Group. He's going to come here to talk about the Tata Nano, the $2,000 car, and its implications for energy and environment in India. Very interesting subject. That's on October 12th, and I urge you to join us here. And then on December 8th, we're going to hear from Bruce Sohn, the president of First Solar, and we'll hear about his perspectives in the renewable energy business. But today, we're going to step back and take a very broad perspective on the future of energy from Steve Koonin. Steve is known to many of you. He's been on the faculty at Caltech since 1975. Since 1995, he was provost there for almost 10 years. He left after serving for almost 10 years at Caltech. As provost, he moved to become the chief scientist at BP. I first met him when he was there, and then moved to take his current position as Undersecretary for Science in the U.S. Department of Energy. Steve has been involved in energy studies for many, many years. He has been part of and past chair of the Jason Study Group, advising the U.S. government on defense science and technology. But his research interests have been incredibly broad in nuclear astrophysics, nuclear physics, computational science, and global environmental science. And it was really through that last interest that I really interacted with Steve. We spent a week together in Santa Barbara a few years ago thinking about engineering the climate and what sort of risks and issues might come up in that discussion. And Steve has always been incredibly thoughtful, but also aware of the broader context in which science communicates to society, and that's something we look forward to hearing about today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Koonin to Harvard.
Thank you. Although I am trained as a scientist, as Dan mentioned, very little of what I want to talk about today involves science. I'm going to concentrate on the politics, economics, and business aspects of the energy scene. I do that not because the technology or the science is unimportant, but because that policy, economics, and business is essential if the technology is going to have an impact. Let's see. Speaking of technology. Otherwise, I'll use the podium. Secondly, having spent significant fractions of my life in the academic sector, in the for-profit sector, and now in government, I think I have an interesting perspective, perhaps, to add to those issues. And so, without further ado. So, I should also remark that this is the first outing of this material, and like any good professor, I will be interested in your feedback at the end about the presentation, both the content and the style in which it's been delivered. So let's start, and let me define rather simply the energy challenges that the country faces, and they are two, and they are somewhat disjoint. One is the issue of energy security, providing a reliable and economic supply of liquid hydrocarbons for transport, i.e. crude oil. There is urgency in addressing this problem because of the finances. We are sending essentially $1 billion a day offshore because of the oil that we're importing, and because of the geopolitics, the 60% of the oil that we're importing every day renders us subject to the fortunes and actions of countries in distant places on the globe. Recognizing that problem, the administration has set a goal of reducing our oil consumption in this country by 3.5 million barrels a day. That's just about 25% of what we use for transportation every day. This is not a new problem. And this graph shows annual oil imports in the U.S. in billions of barrels starting from 1970. And in 1974, Nixon said, in 1980, the U.S. will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need. He's also the guy who started the war on cancer, you will remember. Right? In 1975, when we were importing 36%, Ford said we have to reduce oil imports by 1 million barrels a day and by 2 million barrels a day by the end of 77. Well, we didn't quite get there. And I can go on and on. You get the point, right? Every president. Bush, the younger, breakthroughs will help us reach another great goal, replacing more than 75% by 2025. Well, we got another 15 years to do that. This administration, the president has said, we will reverse our dependence on foreign oil while building a new energy economy that will create millions of jobs. And you can see, in fact, that oil imports did go down the last couple years. All right. We are serious about this, actually. This team in the Department of Energy is serious about trying to make an impact on this problem. The second problem is greenhouse gas emissions, mostly about CO2, and most of it from stationary sources, power and heat. There is urgency here to demonstrate U.S. leadership in getting the rest of the globe to come along because this is a global problem. We also need to avoid locking in infrastructure because power plants last for 50 years. The power plants the world is building today will still be emitting by the middle of this century. And also in U.S. competitiveness. If we can develop the clean energy technologies that the rest of the world wants to buy, that will give us an economic leg up as we go into the next several decades. The administration has set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 17% by the end of this decade and by 83% by the middle of the century, both from the 2005 baseline. As a scientist, I have to tell you I'm somewhat bemused by the two-digit precision in these targets, but particularly 40 years out and for a cumulative problem, but nevertheless, such is the way the system works. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions shown here from 1990 going forward, most of it is CO2, and sure enough, in the last year, the greenhouse gas emissions have started to go down. But lest one gets too excited about that, it's interesting to plot the annual change in GDP versus the annual change in CO2 for those years. And you can see, in fact, it's probably mostly the economy, as you can see from this data. The good news in this chart also is that it is possible to grow the U.S. GDP without growing CO2 emissions too much with the present system we have. And we need to break this link if we're going to have any impact on the greenhouse gas emission problem. So both of those goals imply significant changes in the way that we produce, transmit, store, and use energy. And the job that the government has, I think, is to try to identify, develop, and deploy those solutions that are cost-effective, material, and timely, because we don't have too many decades to deal with this problem, and of course, in the present economic situation, and more generally with the U.S. competitiveness outlook, create jobs in the process. Now, I think anyone who has studied this problem seriously, both the economics and technology, would agree that there are about 7 things we need to do if we're going to address these issues. In the transportation sector, promote vehicle efficiency and conservation. We can right now build an automobile that's 30% more efficient with just an internal combustion engine, 30% improvement in efficiency at an incremental cost of about $2,000 per engine. And the Academy of Sciences has just come out with a study that says we could probably get to almost 40% if we pay another $6,000 per engine. So we need to drive those numbers down, but the efficiencies are there to have. Behavioral changes are also important. Someone quoted to me, and I haven't verified, but it was a credible source, that if the state of Texas just had everyone driving at the speed limit, we would save 12% in fuel use in Texas. Now, that may be more difficult than a gasoline tax, but nevertheless, you get some sense of what's possible. And it's well known that if you keep tires inflated, you can do about 5% in vehicle efficiency. So there are many simple things that could be done. The second is we need to develop alternative vehicle technologies at cost. And this means gradual electrification, I think, of the the light-duty vehicle fleet. There is a succession of technologies from internal combustion engines only to hybrids like the Prius, to plug-in hybrids like the Chevy Volt, and maybe eventually to battery electric vehicles. The pace of that happening depending upon how rapidly battery technologies improve and costs come down. And we will see how far we get, but even a plug-in with a 40-mile electric range would have a substantial impact on oil use. And then finally, we need to pursue unconventional fuels, advanced biofuels derived from cellulose rather than the carbohydrates in plants, of which there are plenty of cellulose crops that we can imagine growing, would have a big impact on our crude use as well. In heat and power, we need again to promote conservation and efficiency, and high on the list here are buildings. 40% of U.S. energy is used in buildings and heat, light, and ventilation. We can do much better on the standards for those buildings, and also standards for appliances that the department is becoming very serious about setting and enforcing. We need to develop and deploy the smart grid and storage associated with that grid that enables the integration of intermittent renewable generation in that grid. It enables efficiency by encouraging people to use electricity at the right time of day, provides flexibility in the system to manage it. See, part of the problem with electrical distribution and generation is that you need to size the system for the maximum load on the system, but that rarely happens, 1 or 2% of the time. And so most of the time those assets are sitting idle or underutilized. And if we can have ways of optimizing the utilization of assets in play, we can in fact improve the efficiency of the grid. Reliability. I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and I've had my power go out about 5 times in the last summer. Quite unbelievable. So reliability is a big issue. And of course, security of the grid is very important. This is an important part of U.S. infrastructure. And in fact, we need to make it as secure as possible. Probably the most important thing we can do is set a price on carbon emissions, whether tax or cap and trade. One can have a long debate. But if we do that and manage to make it reasonably predictable, rising to materiality, like $40 a ton of CO2, and in play across the economy, what we're going to see is a substitution of natural gas for coal. The U.S. has vast reserves now of natural gas as the result of shale and tight gas technologies. The deployment of onshore wind, small and medium hydropower, we have about 76 gigawatts that we can be putting in this country. Fission, the administration has properly noted that nuclear power needs to be an important part of the energy mix going forward if we're going to meet these goals. Carbon capture and storage, a technology yet to be fully demonstrated, but probably also very important if we're going to hit emissions goals. And rapidly coming up, I think, on my own technical horizon is thermal concentrated solar power. Good technical headroom there and already reasonable costs. We can also get at that by setting low carbon power portfolio standards. My own sense, and many other people I've talked with in the business would agree that if you can do these 7 things, you will have made a good step towards solving both the security and greenhouse gas problems. And if you don't do the majority of these things, we're not going to do it. All right, so let's look at, just to see how hard or how rapidly we might be able to affect a change in the U.S. energy system. And this shows the U.S. energy supply since 1850 in quads. A quad is just about, for those of you who are technical types, about 10 to the 18th joules an exajoule. The total U.S. use is about 100 quads a year, 90-something quads a year. And you can see that if you roll back to the time of the Industrial Revolution, coal was really important, and that as the mobility revolution of the mid to late 20th century took over. Oil became very important. Natural gas rising, that red line. Coal, as I mentioned already. And then small fractions of nuclear, hydropower, and renewables. Renewables there are the non-hydro renewables, mostly wind and a little bit of biomass. And what you see from looking at this chart is that rather than decreasing the energy from any given source as a new source comes on, these new sources have just accumulated, piled on top of. We keep using more and more energy, although energy use per capita over the last couple decades has been pretty constant. The other thing you see is that the maximum rate of change on this graph is that section of the petroleum graph in the late 70s, early 80s, where we went down by about 1 quad per year, or about 1% a year. And as I mentioned, the U.S. changes that we're shooting for are on the order of 1 to 1.5 quads a year over the next decade or so, 17% thereabouts. And so the challenges in effecting those changes, as I mentioned, are really quite substantial. This shows the energy supply as a fraction rather than in absolute terms, basically the same numbers on the previous chart. Many people are surprised at how small a fraction of our energy the renewables are. The other thing to take away from this chart is that the energy supply is changing. It changes in response to policy, to technology, and to economics, but the changes happen on many decadal scales. And so given the natural time scale for energy change, we're going to have to do something in order to accelerate it if we're going to hit the goals that I've been talking about. People often get fooled in high technology by what's happened in information technology and in biomed. What I've done to illustrate that is to take the last bar of the energy chart and to expand it into 10 years and show the sales of personal audio and video equipment. And you can see that at the beginning of the century, we were all tapes and CDs, and now you hardly know what those technologies are today. It's all flash and MP3. And so information technology evolves very rapidly, as does some of the biomed work, but in fact the energy system is much slower. It's just very different. And what I'd like to talk about first is talk about some of the structural reasons why that happens, because if we don't understand that, we're not going to solve the problem. The first thing to realize, I think, is that energy supply and energy demand are really quite different. The supply chart is shown on the left here, and to illustrate the demand chart, I've shown what is a classic chart in the energy discussion of U.S. refrigerator technology over something like 60 years or so. And what you see is that certainly from the 70s onward, there's been a dramatic decline in U.S. refrigerator efficiency, or energy use, if you like. Increase in efficiency, at about 6% a year. Wonderful story about engineering, about standards, even as the refrigerator size has increased and the price has come down, mostly because of offshoring of the manufacturing. Nevertheless, a real success story on the demand side. What's the difference? Demand, first of all, will respond to the right signals. If you send a price signal by raising the price of use, if you set standards to encourage greater efficiency, or if you use behavior, all of those can and do, although with some barriers, change the demand picture. The supply side is very different. Those demand technologies allow for very rapid learning. For example, we sell, in this country, about 12 million light-duty vehicles per year, automobiles and light trucks. Okay? So we get to produce a lot of them. We get to come down learning curves pretty rapidly, as we do. They last 10 to 15 years, not an inordinate amount of time, and so the stock turns over pretty quickly. Moreover, people purchase those vehicles not to make money with, but in fact to use for their personal use, mostly. Contrast that with what happens on the supply side. In the U.S. in 2008, we built 5 new coal plants, 94 new gas plants, and about 100 new wind farms. Those assets last for decades. Also, they're put in because somebody expects to make money from them. And so they change much more slowly and more conservatively than what happens on the demand side. You can identify actually about 4 or 5 different factors that make it very difficult or inhibit changes in the energy supply. The first is the scale. To build a power plant is $1 billion for a gas plant, $8 billion for a nuclear plant. A refinery is several $billion. An oil field, one of the offshore oil fields, is $3 billion of investment. That means you need large capital, and you need access to the existing infrastructure to make sure that your facility hooks up to it. So there's the issue of ubiquity. Energy is with us everywhere for heat, light, mobility, information processing. Because of that, many people have an interest in energy. Consumers, producers, governments, NGOs. And the interests don't always align. Cape Wind is an example that comes to mind now, right? And so things move slowly. There's the issue of incumbency. We already have pretty good technologies for producing oil, electricity, transport. Any new technologies introduced are going to have to compete on cost in a commodity business. Nobody can tell the difference between electrons that come from renewables as opposed to coming from a coal plant, at least at the consumer level. The same is true for fuel molecules. And so it's a commodity business, making the entry of new technologies really quite difficult. And then finally, there's longevity, as I mentioned. Energy facilities are big and last a long time. That, coupled with the commodity nature of the business, means that the payback times are long, 30-year time horizon, which means that when you're investing in an energy facility, you're making a multi-decadal judgment or bet on what's going to happen with the energy business. And for all of these reasons, it makes it more difficult than you might think to change energy supply. You can capture that in a rather simple syllogism, the first element of which is that the U.S. energy system is almost entirely in the hands of the for-profit sector. For-profit sector owns generating, transmission, refineries, pipelines, distribution system. A little bit of it is in government hands, the so-called power marketing administrations in the, which are part of the DOE, TVA, for example. While that's true, there are various regulatory bodies. There are about 3,000 different public utility commissions in the U.S. that influence the electrical system. And those governmental entities do have regulatory influence, and they often inhibit innovation in supply. The objective of most public utility commissions is to keep the rates down for the consumers and to ensure that the businesses supplying that electricity are in good financial condition. Their business is not necessarily innovation, or their goals are not necessarily innovation. The second is that the government does not have sufficient capital to scale energy innovation on its own. In 2008, the U.S. had about 600 coal power plants and about 1,700 natural gas plants and about 100 fission plants. The total capital value is in the scale of trillions of these assets. The capital investment in 2008 in power generation was more than $25 billion, and U.S. industry invests $200 billion a year or more on average in the energy system. Okay. Those are big numbers, even on the government scale. So the government cannot take new energy technologies to scale on its own. Just a word about funding for R&D. You can get a sense of the relative magnitudes of government and private. This is for total U.S. R&D funding. Private industry significantly more than the federal government. And if you break the federal investment out according to different categories, you can see energy over here is this little green bar, about $4 billion a year in energy research. When I was in BP, the total capital budget in BP, and I think it still is about $20 billion a year. Just about comparable to the whole DOE budget. And any of the big energy companies are comparable. So what the government has to do is to leverage and catalyze action in the private sector. It can't do it by itself. The second element of the syllogism is that industry's goal is legal and predictable profit. There is no shame in that. That's what industry is supposed to do. The profit goes to the shareholders, by and large. Sometimes it goes up and sometimes it goes down. It needs to be legal, which means that government regulations do, in fact, influence what industry does. And it also needs to be predictable, because, as I mentioned, the investment horizons here are multi-decadal. You put those two together, energy system is in the hands of industry, industry's goal is profit. You can then conclude that the energy supply will change materially only when business finds it profitable or it's mandated to do so, right? Either market conditions or regulation or both are the only thing that's going to get the system to shift. It's pretty simple, almost trite. On the other hand, I think it has profound implications for understanding how we're going to have a material impact on the energy system. To say it another way, a bit more flippantly, we only get the energy transformation that the government enables. This is the rate-limiting step in making things change. Let me just show you an example of the influence of regulation on that. This shows the annual installation of wind capacity in the U.S. over the last decade or so. There is something called the production tax credit, which makes it quite economically favorable to put wind in. And you can see, and because of the vagaries of the political process, it tended to come and go in the early part of this century. And you can see that when the PTC was there, industry put wind in. When the PTC wasn't there, industry didn't put wind in. Pretty simple, right? That's about all the economics I can do, actually. Sorry. The same is true for biofuels. There was a mandate to put in corn ethanol in the U.S. Up to a certain, there's something called the VEETC. That is the volumetric ethanol excise tax credit. Basically, at the beginning of this period, you got 51 cents a gallon credit for putting ethanol in your gasoline mix. And you can see that as various standards encourage that, we've got capacity of ethanol growing. Independent of the wisdom of corn ethanol, I'm not going to comment on that. But then when the tax credit was reduced to 40 cents a gallon and the market started to saturate, we see no new ethanol plants going in. Right? So the point is that the economics and the regulation really do influence what business does. But what also influences business decisions is a judgment of risk and return. And this is, again, my amateur business experience, is that the investment of capital and balancing risk against return is at the heart of business decisions. As you can see here, some real data, different kinds of businesses have different rates of return, and some of them are more predictable than others. The utility business, for reasons of regulation and commodity, is pretty predictable at a 10% return. What surprised me, the internet was not such a great investment, right? But look at the variance. Some won, some didn't. The restaurant business, that surprised me a lot, right? You think about restaurants as operating by the skin of their teeth. These are publicly traded companies, and so we're talking here about McDonald's and things like that, rather than the small restaurants. Anyway, balancing risk against return is what business is about, and that certainly enters into the decisions it makes about the energy business. When you do an energy project, an energy supply project, there are many kinds of risk. There's market risk, your bet against what the prices are going to look like, again, 20 or 30 years out. Policy risk, the policies that influence the product you produce may change. After all, our congressional cycle is 2 years presidential cycle is 4 years, and you just need to look historically at the variation in energy policies. There's operations risk. Can you operate the facility efficiently enough in order to make the profit margins, which are often rather small? Supply risk, if you need supply feedstocks of various kinds, etc. Technology risk is certainly a part of this picture. On the other hand, when you are putting in a big system, there are many other levers that you can pull, and often these are the most important levers. Technology is only one piece of the picture, and remember, the goal of business is profit. It is not to deploy the most innovative technology or the greenest technology, but it is simply to make money. Innovation or being green may be an important part of that strategy, but it is not the goal in the end. This is somewhat sobering for people like myself, and it was a very interesting lesson for me to learn early on in the private sector, is that you come in as a scientist and you say, I'm just going to invent the right thing, and that's going to change everything. And that just is not true at all. Innovation is important, but changes in the energy system are much slower, and they make technical innovation very conservative as you look at these big facilities. This is a chart that shows a typical development cycle for fuel in this case. You start out with laboratory scale work where you invest millions and maybe can do 1/100th of a barrel a day. It's like half a gallon. And then you gradually scale it up over more than a decade until you get to a full-scale facility and infrastructure where you're investing billions and maybe doing 50,000 barrels a day. For reference, a big refinery, just since we're talking about fuels, is 400,000 barrels a day is a good size refinery. So you get a sense of the scale. Why is the scale, why does it take so long? It's because if you're going to invest that much money, you had better be sure the technology is going to work. And that takes a long time and a lot of proof and a lot of refinement. The technology that we use to scrub SOx and NOx out of coal plants these days took 4 generations and 40 years in order to perfect it. So, time scales are long. Change is generally incremental. That is just the nature of the beast when one is working with these big energy systems. Another thing is worth remarking on is that you will have heard a number of venture capitalists, probably some standing in this room in previous talks in this series, saying again they got just the thing that's going to change the energy picture. Again, some data is useful for comparison. This shows the number of venture capital funds, the histogram, and the average size of a venture capital fund in millions of dollars. And you can see that recently in 2009, it's been about $150 million for the total size of the fund. Remember, I told you one full-scale power plant is $1 billion. All right? And so while the venture capitalists perhaps have a role in getting some interesting technology started, they cannot take it to scale. And that taking to scale not only involves large capital, but it involves long time horizons, whereas the VC expected exit time, either through an IPO or a buyout, is less than a decade. The energy assets are not liquid. They have small and predictable rates of return. All of this is meant to say the energy business is not the venture capital business. And you will hear people in the VC world saying that the energy business just doesn't know about anything about taking risk and about innovation. And I would say it's precisely the opposite. The energy business is all about managing risk, but on a very long time scale and a very large capital scale. Right? It's just different. So, what should the government do given this context? And I think the simple framework and format is to think like a business. If you're going to try to get the private sector to act, it is best to understand what drives them and to try to tune your actions with that in mind. The first thing is well-considered and consistent policies. If nothing else, business plays to predictability and consistency. That's not to say that things shouldn't ever change, but things should change slowly in a predictable way so that you can make the kind of investments that are required. Well considered, of course, so that we don't wind up with dumb results. Not always easy in the energy world. The second thing is to think about the risk-reward calculus and mitigate the risks for early movers and early adopters. When you're the first one to deploy a technology, you are taking an additional risk, and what can we do to mitigate that? There is a technology risk, of course, and the government can work to make technologies as refined and predictable as possible. The national laboratories are great assets that we're trying to deploy in order to mitigate the risk for technologies at the pre-competitive level. Simulation is something that I'll come back to toward the end, but the use of computers, I think, has a lot to offer here in reducing technology risk. And also test beds. If you want to do, for example, a new catalyst that will take syngas to some chemicals, if you want to test that out at scale, you need to invest in all of the technology or all the hardware that's going to produce the syngas for you and deal with the product. If the government could produce a test bed where you as a small researcher or small company could come in and drop your catalyst in at scale and see how it works, test it out, that would be a good thing to facilitate the scaling of technology and reduce the technical risks. Market risk is important for making the economics of projects more attractive. We need to go to renewable portfolio standards, renewable fuel standards, power purchase agreements, where a utility will guarantee to purchase power from a facility at a fixed rate for a long time in return for that fixed rate. That helps the economics a lot also of these big projects. And then finally, capital risk. The government is, the Department of Energy in particular these days, has cranked up its loan guarantee program. We, the DOE, are helping to issue loan guarantees for large energy projects to help reduce the cost of capital and help get innovative technologies deployed. The largest we have done is of order $8 billion to help get the first 2 fission reactors started in this country in the last 30 years. Hopefully they will get started in Georgia within the next couple of years. We've also done loans in the automobile sector. Tesla, Nissan, Ford are all recipients of these loan guarantees. The other thing we can do to mitigate capital risk, I didn't put on this chart, is to try to reduce the quantum of economic investment in an energy system. So I'll use the nuclear example. A full-size nuclear plant is $8 billion right now in round numbers. If we can develop and prove out small reactors, so-called small modular reactors, for which you have to put down only $1.5 billion, all right, for, let's say, 200 megawatts, then you can start to simplify the licensing procedure. You can use the first one to get the cash flow started to build the next one. You can stamp them out in a fairly consistent way. So reducing the quantum of capital is also important here as a business perspective. Just a word about the numbers and organization in the Department of Energy to give you a sense of the leverage that we have or don't have financially. The department is organized according to 3 functional pillars. The National Nuclear Security Administration under Tom D'Agostino, the Energy Technologies offices, and then the Basic Research offices under my position. And if you look at the numbers, we spend about $5 billion a year in basic research, everything from basic biology, climate science, advanced computing research, chemistry, materials science, and so on. We spend another $10 billion a year in round numbers on nuclear security matters, the care and feeding of the current stockpile, prevention of proliferation, detection of proliferation, and the design of naval reactors. And then we spend about $6 billion a year in the energy area, not for energy technologies, but for waste cleanup. And we spend about $4 billion a year on energy technologies, as I mentioned, both the applied research and the development and demonstration of them. So it's that $4 billion plus some part of the $5 billion that gives us perhaps leverage on moving the private sector. We have tried to set up this administration, under the Secretary's leadership and with the help from a lot of us, a set of research structures that span the basic and applied to try to move research more quickly from the laboratory out to scale up. The Energy Frontier Research Centers at a few million a year, focused on very basic research. The Energy Innovation Hubs that span basic research through initial demonstrations with a significant private sector involvement. RPE, the newest one here, just a year old, meant to be nimble, short-term funding of high-risk concepts with an immediate practical application. And then finally, the base programs in energy, which work to scale up business-ready technologies by private industry, for example, using the loan guarantee programs and other mechanisms that we have. So we are trying to take a holistic view of the energy innovation and ultimately deployment chain. Let me say a word about simulation, which in my mind is one of the higher leverage technology things we have to offer. Some of you may know that in the course of the last 15 years, the Department of Energy has mounted a major effort to apply high-performance computer modeling to, in the initial case, the nuclear weapons stockpile. When nuclear testing was stopped, underground nuclear testing was stopped in the early 90s, the country embarked on a deliberate strategy involving simulation and above-ground experiments to try to ensure the reliability and effectiveness of the nuclear stockpile. And that effort over the last 15 years, first of all, accelerated computing capabilities by a factor of 10,000 relative to what we had in 1995. It also developed a remarkable capability to integrate experiments, data, with computer models to achieve a truly predictive capability. Also, since the beginning of the century, since 2000, the Office of Science, that basic research arm of the department, has made high-performance computing available to the academic community for science purposes. And in fact, the world's fastest machines are now in that office. The fastest right now is about a 3 petaflop, 3/10 to the 15th operations per second machine at Oak Ridge. And we have plans to go to 20 petaflops. What we need to learn how to do is to take that simulation capability in the NNSA and in the Office of Science and focus it on energy problems. If we can develop predictive simulation capabilities for energy systems, we can optimize designs, we can shorten design cycles, and we can facilitate that transition from the laboratory to full-scale deployment. We have 2 examples already. Here, they're a couple years old now. The Cummins engine company was able to use simulation to reduce the design time of one of the diesel engines that it is marketing today. And similarly, the Goodyear Tire Company used simulation in order to produce an entirely new kind of tire, and I am told basically saved the company by being able to develop and sell this product. We need to do more of this faster. It's a unique American competitive advantage. It plays to U.S. strengths, particularly in the Department of Energy, and will get us to our energy goals, I think, faster than we might otherwise. High on the candidate list are the internal combustion engine, which is a great mix of chemistry, thermal physics, and computational fluid dynamics. Carbon capture and storage, being able to model and simulate those systems. The grid, we have recently stood up one of the energy innovation hubs to model and simulate nuclear reactors, light water reactors at Oak Ridge, in collaboration with academia, the labs, and the private sector, there to help extend the lifetime of the existing fleet of light water reactors. So this looks like a major theme going forward. Stimulus money was a great help in this also. The DOE has received and is almost finished allocating about $35 billion in clean energy investments. You can see the great majority of it has gone to energy efficiency and renewable energy, but also to the smart grid, RPE, and so on. And these are real projects that are out there trying to make a difference and we've leveraged them to more than $100 billion as we go forward. So let me wrap up a couple of high-level conclusions. One is that the energy supply business is not simple. All right? It just is a lot more complicated than people think, and the people who are in it are not troglodytes. All right? They're not reactionary, ignorant folks. They are doing their best to try to optimize answers in a long-term, high-risk business. The second is that the government's most effective role in enabling transformations is not so much in the very basic research we're doing, but is in trying to mitigate industry risk by setting the playing field through policies and through economics, by facilitating large-scale demonstrations, cost-sharing with industry on those first demonstrations of innovative technologies, and supporting pre-competitive research in the labs and the universities, and then the tech transfer mechanisms that can take it out to industry. And then finally, facilitating knowledge transfer by technology, user facilities, and data dissemination. If the department funds a demo and it's a failure, that's almost as valuable as funding a demo that's a success, and we should be able to get the information learned out to the broader community. And then finally, my own experience. I spent 5 years in the private sector, and it was an extraordinarily enlightening experience given my previous just academic exposure. For those of you who want to change the energy industry, you really have to get to know it, and I would strongly advise those of you in that situation to spend some time in one of the energy businesses, just so that you can get an appreciation for what it takes to really have an impact on the real world. And with that, thanks for your attention, and happy to take some questions or comments.
Okay, as you can see, we have two microphones set up here, one on the right and one on the left, and we're going to go back and forth and take questions. I'm going to take the prerogative, though, and actually ask Steve the first question. Steve, so I know, and I asked this question knowing that the loan guarantee program and a lot of the investment in deployment and demonstration is not under the Office of Science, and so you're not directly responsible for it. But it seemed like the Department of Energy was really anticipating congressional action on climate and putting a price on carbon, and made a lot of loan guarantees and direct grants to projects that might have been profitable with a $20 a ton price on CO2, but when the Senate failed to act, essentially these projects were high and dry. Many of the large loan guarantees you put out ultimately were not used. Is there a rethinking about how to use the mechanism of a loan guarantee within the Department of Energy now?
So I sit on the board that helps approve and recommend to the Secretary the loan guarantees for these big projects. And I can tell you that at least the ones I've been involved with now, so for over the last year and a half, do have to be commercially viable in their own right, absent a carbon price. And so we're doing those that get new technologies started and demonstrated, and that certainly encourage efficiency, for example, which is good for all seasons. The carbon price discussion is, as you well know, a very long-term thing. The technology demonstrations are long-term. One hopes a carbon price will be there, and we need to get the technologies developed and demonstrated now if we're going to move rapidly when we're going to respond to the push of that. So there's still a very strong commitment to developing those technologies, even if right now they're not commercially viable.
Great. Now, we're going to go back and forth. If you could please state your name and your affiliation, and keep your questions short because there are a lot of people who want to ask them.
My name is Michael Siegel. I'm not sure I have a relevant affiliation, but I wanted to ask about Senators Hatch and Reid have introduced legislation to promote research into thorium-based nuclear reactors with a vision that they would have less waste produced and basically no bomb proliferation risk. What's the attitude within the Energy Department about the feasibility of this, and how interested are you in this legislation?
We have had, if you know the history of the Nuclear Energy Office, NE, in the Department of Energy, it's had a very turbulent history. and I think we're trying to put it on a firm footing right now. Highest on the plate is extension of the existing light water fleet. Also, very much on our minds is response to the Blue Ribbon Commission that will be reporting on how we manage the back end of the fuel cycle. And then there's some work on second and third generation uranium-based systems. We're certainly aware of the interest in the thorium systems, but frankly, right now it's just one more thing to take on, and we're watching, but I don't think at the moment we plan any major investments. We're certainly talking a lot to folks. Sorry?
Even if they provide extra funds?
Well, you know, in the end, we're at the direction of our Citizens Advisory Board on Capitol Hill. And, okay.
Please.
Hi, my name's Ari. I'm at the law school. The Department of Education recently had this race to the top. My basic understanding of it is that states adopted federal standards and basically competed for federal funds. Does that sort of thing make sense at all for energy?
There are a number of grant programs, and I can't go into the details because I don't have them at my fingertips, that reach down at the state and local level and are encouraging states that are competitively awarded to try to put in efficiency measures. So, sure, you can do that. I mean, in the end, it's got to get to the local level.
Hello, my name is Ramon Sanchez, and I'm from the Harvard School of Public Health.
Hi.
And, my question is regarding innovation at the small scale, and let me tell you what I mean. I started in microalgae farming for biofuels, but when I went to a venture capitalist, he said, well, go to omega-3, okay, fatty acids, forget about biofuels, yes. Okay? And we did. A few years later, we optimized the system and everything, and it's ready for biofuels. How do we go back in order to tell you, hey, we are ready for biofuels and those things? And if so, how do we create synergies with other people? Like, for example, the main limiting factor 5 years ago was to get enough carbon dioxide for the algae. But some people that have been working on CCS solved the problem, okay? So how do we integrate these things and try to regroup and try to do something together?
So, that is the role of the Energy Technologies offices in the Department of Energy. We look at proposals, we push programs forward and try to make the kind of things you're talking about happen. In the particular example you're talking about, I can't comment. We are doing an algal program. But again, economics and scale are the things that in the end are going to really make a difference. And so in that particular example, I'd ask, how many dollars per gallon is it going to cost you to produce the biofuels? And can you imagine doing 50,000 barrels a day, which is the kind of scale you need to have an impact?
Please.
I'm John Carlton Foss, and I'm an alum.
Hi, John.
I and one other person and I have been deeply involved with getting the utility energy efficiency program in Massachusetts to leverage their resources much more by opening up the process to independent contractors. And my impression has been a lot of good people, I agree, in the electric industry and the gas industry, and it's not all that creative. They're perfectly happy to operate essentially 100% on ratepayer and government money, but when you have the appropriate political forces acting on them, then they cooperate. So the question is, what is the federal government able to do? My impression is not much at the state level to encourage people to leverage and create jobs.
Yeah. Very difficult. We have a wonderful federal system that's got lots of advantages in moving things down to the local level, but it's very tough to get coherent action going forward. A national renewable electricity standard or low carbon electricity standard would be great if we could do that. So, your carbon emissions per kilowatt hour shall be no more than half a kilogram or whatever the right number is, and to have that going down with time would be great. Beyond that, it's tough. It's very tough. Transmission's also an issue, as you may know. Siting of power lines to enable moving wind power around and so on is also a big issue. Tough.
Please.
I'm Carl from MIT. One of my favorite professors has this idea that energy regulation should be loud, long, and legal. These map pretty directly to your ideas of meaningful, predictable, and legal. The loud is hard enough to get, trying to get an energy legislation that actually does something rather than just being a token effort. But even once you've got loud, how do you get long when any given policy that you enact can be destroyed immediately next year's budget, much less the 2-year congressional cycle? How do you actually have energy legislation stay?
And I would defer to people who are professional political scientists here, but one of the things I think I've learned, or at least heard in Washington, is that it's a lot harder to take away a law than it is to put it into place. And so, you know, you might offer some comfort or take some comfort if we can actually get something passed. Although, you know, the attempt now to roll back AB 32 in California perhaps speaks against that if they're successful. The other thing is you can try to take some analogies in asking what are the longest-lived federal initiatives that we've had in the country. I think it starts with the national parks that have been around for a long time. Social Security has been around for a long time. There are a couple of others that extend over several generations. So the system is capable of doing that sometimes. I have no other wisdom to offer, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for coming. I'm Matthew Bunn. I'm one of the principal investigators for our project on this kind of issue over at the Kennedy School. I had 2 quick questions. I loved your focus on trying to sort of incentivize the private sector investment, which is ultimately the key. But you ended with technology demonstrations as one of the key elements. And as far as I know, we have a record unblemished by success in large-scale technology demonstration in the energy space. So I wondered if you had some thoughts about how we could do that better in the future. And secondly, how can we, in addition to the R&D we're funding through the federal government, incentivize additional R&D in the private sector, which may be better targeted toward the things the private sector is actually going to end up deciding to deploy? I mean, going beyond the obvious thing of having a price on carbon.
So this interface with the private sector in the energy technologies is probably the most troublesome or problematic aspect of what the department does. And part of it is philosophical, and part of it, you know, what do you believe the proper role of government should be relative to the private sector? And part of it is just practical. How do you get people to invest $100 million each in a consortium with IP issues and so on? I would maybe first start by challenging the unblemished record comment. And I think if you go back, and again, I'm happy to be corrected, if you go back to the 50s in civilian nuclear power, the government probably did a pretty good job of stimulating new technology there. Of course, different circumstances in different times. And then secondly, one example that I know pretty well from, if you'll excuse me, a recent MIT report on natural gas is the coal bed methane story, where the government did some pre-competitive research on how you extract methane from coal beds back in the late 70s. There was the appropriate handoff to business. There was a tax or financial incentive which disappeared in the late or early 2000s, and you see the CBM production going up. So that's a pretty good success story. I cynically said it was inadvertent, and in fact it was quite deliberate, and the government was able to do that pretty well. So there are some success stories, but they're not as many as one would like. What can we do to, look, in the end it's money, right? So R&D tax credits, predictable change in the environment to encourage businesses to invest in research, and then facilitating partnerships with the labs and academia, I would say, was also something we should be doing.
Hello, my name is Sachin. I'm a law student here, and I've also interned with the DOE at Freedom Car.
Oh, great.
My question relates to, I guess, innovation from disruptants or new entrants. Of course, you'll see some innovation provided by the larger players. But in terms of getting new entrants into the system, what do you see as I know you've already spoke to this a little bit, but what do you see as some of the places where new entrants are most able to enter the system right now? Where do you think they should be? And what can we do to get them from where they are now to getting them where they should be?
So on the demand side is where I think you see the greatest potential for let me call it small-scale innovation, right? If you invent, I don't know, the right kind of electric motor that's more efficient, or the right kind of gizmo that will make an automobile much more efficient than it is, there I think you can see potential for innovation that could be taken to scale pretty rapidly by a small company. Allowing people to monitor and measure their own energy use more effectively, each of the individual appliances, right? These are IT kinds of innovations that I think are very productive. Beyond that, perhaps some of the chemical technologies, decomposition of cellulose, for example, or a better catalyst, you could imagine a small firm trying to do, but that would have to be taken up by a big company to really be taken to commercial demonstration and then to scale. So IT things and demand side things is what I would look at for innovation, small companies.
Please, and we're just going to take 3 more because we're going to run out of time.
I'm Jeremy from MIT Lincoln Laboratory, and my question is about the potential motivation and impact of the policy that China has for new manufacturing efficiencies that is recently announced.
Yeah, so this is the commitment to reduce carbon intensity by 20% in some number of years, or is there something else?
I think that they recently announced a mandate for the energy efficiency of new manufacturing facilities to be built in China.
Okay.
And since they are a fairly major manufacturing center in the world.
Look, the energy efficiency of the Chinese economy, I mean, there's a chart I usually show that shows where China is relative to the rest of the world in terms of energy use per GDP. It's way off scale high, the energy use, not the efficiency. And if they manage to achieve the 20% reduction that they announced, which I'm sure this is part of that effort, they will be just in line with other countries at a comparable stage of development, nothing more. And so it's great that they're going to try to get back to everybody else in the pack, and that itself is going to take an heroic effort, but it won't get them much further than everybody else right now.
Please.
Hi there, my name's Matt. I'm a System Design and Management Fellow at MIT. You talked a lot about the domestic aspects of a problem that has a lot of international impact to it, both because of climate effects and because a lot of the companies who are playing in this operate across borders. What are your opinions on how we can help companies developing projects abroad in this area? And conversely, should companies from abroad receive funding to receive some of these, or rather not funding, support to execute some of these projects domestically to help achieve these goals?
Yeah. So as we are allocating funds at the latter stage of the innovation chain, we are certainly considering applications from foreign companies, whatever that means these days, right? As long as the projects are executed in the U.S. and involve U.S. jobs and so on. I mean, that's the main goal of some of the money is involved. I think, when you look at other countries, and China is, of course, the prime example, but there are others as well, they're building infrastructure anew. They have reason to do it at great pace, and they have different capital and regulatory regimes than we do in the U.S., a very interesting place to think about demoing new technologies in partnership with indigenous firms. So some of that is going on also.
Thank you.
Richard, please.
Richard Wilson in physics. You commented that the development of a civilian nuclear power might be a success story, and that indeed in 1972 a nuclear power plant was being produced they were being made and sold at less than $300 per kilowatt installed. But he also mentioned we're now $8 billion per plant, which is $6,000 Right. Now, how is it that what was a success story is not a lasting success story?
So I'll give you one factoid. I don't know what happens if you inflate things for cost of living, but the overnight cost of a nuclear plant is about $4 a watt, whereas the actual as-built cost, because of construction, licensing, etc., is twice that, $8 a watt, right? Or $8,000 a kilowatt. So if we can ease that delay process, we can go a long way. In the end, this is not about technology or practicalities. It's about the system that we wrap around it and how efficient that is, or not.
How high are the return on investments for those first nuclear plants that are required by the investors because of the risk?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to say exactly what the numbers are, but what I can tell you is that when we look at these loans, we look at them very carefully from a commercial perspective.
And are they inflated because of that risk?
The returns
a lot
are
of the
inflated.
extra cost must come from the higher rates of return required to get people to...
Yeah, so with those higher costs, they're still economically viable. So,
okay. Last question, please.
Isaac Silvera from the physics department. One of the best ways to incentivize the development of efficient automobiles or vehicles is to make the price of fuel expensive. And of course, we've seen it here in America when the price went up to $4 or $5 a gallon. And a good example is Europe, where it's been 3 to 4 times the price of fuel here for many years. So the question is there anything? I think I understand the problem that it might be political suicide to try to increase the price of gasoline with taxation. But is there anything that can be done other than making the oil companies wealthy to help incentivize the development of this efficient fleet?
Sure. Well, look, the CAFE standards are doing that. We are raising the CAFE standards. We're in the process of going from 27 or 28 to 35 by miles per gallon by 2016, and there's headroom to go well above that. And so if you can't, look, you have 3 levers, right? Price, and what I was going to say when you suggested raising the price is that you're obviously not running for public office. You've got price, you've got standards, the CAFE standards, and then you've got behavior. Imagine that every time you filled up at the pump, you paid not only for the fuel, but you paid the depreciation on the car and the road taxes and the insurance. You might start to realize what the real cost of driving is and perhaps use a bit less. So that's what we got.
So on that note, please join me in thanking Steve for coming to Harvard.